What would you consider the golden era of trading card games and collectible card games? Would it be the 90s? I mean, it's where a lot of the big card games got their start. There are some TCGs and CCGs that came out before the 90s, but this is heavily considered the first decade of card games proper. Magic, Pokemon, and Yu-Gi-Oh! All came out in the 90s. These companies didn't really know what they were doing. Like, Magic printed a bunch of grossly overpowered cards, side by side with some of the worst cards and sets they've ever come up with. They had something special, they just hadn't fully worked it out yet. Could the golden era be right now? Like sometime in the 2010s forward. It definitely feels like the cream has risen to the top. We have the best card games in the world that are still going strong, and the odd flash in the pan card game keeps popping up and keeps things fresh. But we're starting to really feel that late stage capitalism staleness. Like zooming in on Magic, it seems like Magic the Gathering and its corporate overlords will stop at nothing to milk the average Magic player dry of any penny they have. But let's hedge our bets then. If the year 2000 backwards isn't the golden era and the year 2011 forward isn't the golden era, well, maybe it's somewhere in the middle. Oh dear viewer, I can promise you, it is not somewhere in the middle. Hi, I'm Harrison, I run these here parts, and I'm currently in the early stages of moving. So my apartment is getting moved around drastically right now, so you're not going to see the usual set pretty much anymore, or at least not for a couple more months. Don't worry, we have Japanese Saskia to show you that I really like Magic. I want to talk about dead trading card games today. Back in October, I made a video on dead TCGs and CCGs. It was a really fun video. I enjoyed making it, but more importantly, you enjoyed watching it. Thanks to everyone who voted in my poll on deciding what this video was. Now in that video, I just jumped all around. I hopped around from example to example of some of my favorite just wacky card games from whenever. From Austin Powers to American Idol to one of my favorites, which was just a system to play a game in that included like a base set that was Shaman King. And if you don't know what Shaman King is, I don't blame you. It's an anime, it's a manga. Apparently it has a big fan base behind it because whenever I bring it up, everyone's just like, how do you not know what Shaman King is? So the base set, the first set for this whole system was Shaman King. The second one was Avatar: The Last Airbender. I was like, oh my god, you have my attention now. And then the third one and final set that came out for this card game was the movie series Pirates of the Caribbean. I hope I'm not the only one that finds that absolutely wild and hilarious. Now I'm back and I want to put some more order to this. I want to talk about the early to mid 2000s and how it's just a graveyard of trading card games. A little preamble before we get into the capitalist hell that is the 2000s era of card games. In 1993, Richard Garfield, a board game designer and great-great-grandson of American President James A. Garfield, launched the game Magic the Gathering with Wizards of the Coast. He originally wanted to make a game called Robo Rally. Wizards of the Coast said it would be too expensive to produce, but they ultimately made a deal with WotC saying, hey, if you produce some other game, some smaller scale game that maybe only uses like small cards, we can use the profits from that and put it towards Robo Rally. Fortunately enough, Richard Garfield was actually working on a game since the early 80s called The Five Magics. He dusted it off, gave it some moderate changes, and playtested it at Penn State University. Eventually he gave it to WotC to release, and then him and a bunch of his friends from Penn State started designing and testing more games. The idea for most games before this was that if you bought a game, you bought a game. It was entirely self-contained. You could go to the store and say, I would like to buy one game, please, and they would hand it to you in full. You would have the complete game there. Magic the Gathering shook up the formula. You couldn't really go to a store and spend hundreds of dollars on Monopoly because unless they're releasing some special edition version of that game, you usually only need to buy one copy of it to just have that game. But you could spend hundreds of dollars on packs of Magic cards. Magic was an instant hit. Stores could not keep product on shelves. People couldn't get enough of these guys. A bunch of other companies tried to cash in on this craze, but no one could dethrone the king. Now I'm going to do an important time jump for the purposes of this video, but keep in mind, over this time jump a bunch of stuff changes. So that was early 90s, we're moving towards the later half of the 90s. Magic had caused the big interest spike back then. A few years had passed and the roads were a lot more rocky. The TCG industry was a lot more volatile back then. If WotC produced a new set of Magic and it was Fallen Empires or Homelands, or it was just garbage, that could really shake up and potentially lead to this, is this the death of Magic talk. It's not like today where if they produce a product that everyone hates, you don't have to worry about it because 2 weeks from now, no one will remember it because there's another 5 sets that have come out since then. So in this time, Richard Garfield gets a patent to cover Magic the Gathering. But depending on how you read the wordings of this patent, it covers tons of other card games as well. Like, it's hard to think of a card game that isn't technically covered by this patent. He transfers this patent to Wizards of the Coast, and then everyone starts calling out Wizards of the Coast for being super shifty in this time. Like, this is step one in trying to blow up your competition and create a monopoly. WotC's then CEO steps in and just says he wants the ability to be compensated by others who incorporate our patented method of play into their games, and that he doesn't intend on stifling other card games that only have their success because of Magic the Gathering. This is CEO talk for we're about to get paid. We were here first and you all owe us big because of Magic the Gathering. A bit more of a time jump, now we're really into the late 90s, and Wizards of the Coast is dominating with Magic the Gathering. Magic the Gathering then accounts for 50% of all card game sales in the world. 7 new card games come out that year, 5 of which are made by Wizards of the Coast. They got the full effect of their monopoly, they were making tons of money, but this industry was dying. It almost seemed like things were just wrapping up at that point. Sure, there were card games now, but give it a couple of years, things will be done. The writing's on the wall. That was until it came. Wizards of the Coast releases the first English translation of Pokemon. It is riding the surge of fans from the Game Boy game that came out earlier the same year. There is finally a card game that is outselling Magic. The TCG market starts to take off again. Lots of people and companies are trying to buy back in. Walmart and Target actually start selling packs in store. Hasbro then steps in and buys Wizards of the Coast for $750 million. This is what we wandered into, the awful storm of card games. Pokemon gave a lot of companies that owned the rights to beloved franchises hope. The hope that they could just make a crap ton of money out of nowhere now. Like, this isn't like Magic. Magic was based on its own property. Pokemon started as a video game, then became heavily inspired by Magic the Gathering to make a card game based off of the video game success. Then, of course, the beloved anime that came with it, that follows too. The original creator of Pokemon, Satoshi Tajiri, has a similar story to Richard Garfield, the creator of Magic the Gathering. Though both of the games seem like they came out of nowhere and were almost immediately massive successes, both Satoshi and Richard had been making their games since the 80s. They had spent time developing their beloved IP before it ever saw the market. Like, you might not think of Pokemon and Magic the Gathering as like 80s core, but both were being developed while everyone else was wearing leg warmers, rocking mullets, and listening to glam rock. I had to ask an AI to help with that last line there. I wasn't even alive until several years after the 80s ended. My point here is that Magic the Gathering and Pokemon had shown the world that card games could be super popular and super profitable. If you were scared away from the first time TCG craze happened because Magic the Gathering was an original IP, so you didn't want to have to put in your own new effort into this, now you could be comforted by an existing IP coming in and dominating the market. And oh boy, too many companies were comforted by this fact. Let's take a look at some of those wacky card games. Let's start with 24. Yeah, the action drama show from Fox from the early 2000s. If you don't know the show, a very quick rundown. It was this action show. It featured the main character who was dealing with another terrorist crisis every season. The main gimmick of the show was that each season was 24 episodes. Each episode covers roughly an hour. So if you do the math, each season is a 24-hour day. And Jack Bauer, the main character, is saving the day. Looking back into it, it's actually kind of interesting seeing the main character foil a terrorist plot when this show started in November of 2001. Obviously, the show had to have been planned beforehand, like before September of that year. But I can definitely see why people who enjoy watching Fox might flock to a show like that. I've heard good things about that show, but I've only really heard about that from my grandmother because that was her favorite show back then. But who cares if a medium that you're trying to crack into's key demographics are young adults and children, let's make a game for those older demographics. Decks were 24 cards and you won by scoring 24 points. Looks like they really had a motif they were going for here. Next game or batch of games that I really wanted to talk about were sports games. I really wanted to bring this up in the October video, but it got cut for time just because there's so much to talk about. There were a series of sports games all with the Showdown moniker, put out by WotC in the early 2000s. When I say series, I don't mean necessarily like individual sets. There was one game for every major sport in North America besides the NHL, and I know that's more than likely because hockey doesn't have as big as an audience as other sports. Like the NHL keeps trying to move into cities that have no interest in hockey, and I have to painfully and prolongedly learn the same lesson every single time. But I choose to believe that they didn't do it because they were cowards. There was MLB Showdown, which came out in 2000. A new core set would drop every April to align with opening day, and this actually would release a whopping 20 sets before it was all said and done. They'd release the core set to start off the year, but then they'd release promotions throughout. Hey, your team made some moves at the trade deadline, now you got some fancy new cards. I'll be honest, I know football, I can fake like I know hockey, but boy, basketball and baseball are massive blind spots for me. The game had some complaints because it heavily relied on just randomness, like you rolled a d20 every turn to see how the game went. But I imagine since baseball cards are already such a collectible item, to base a game around it, you already had that established market that could just keep it sustainable that way. Now, where MLB Showdown lasted from 2000 to 2006 before being shut down, the others weren't so lucky. Both NFL Showdown and NBA Showdown started after their baseball counterpart. NFL Showdown started in 2001. Cards included the actual players, the plays that you'd be running, and then strategy cards. Calling them strategy cards was kind of laughable because a bunch of them are just penalties that you're forcing the other team to commit. I know there are plenty of times in football that people can do certain maneuvers to draw flags, but that feels too nuanced to be in a card game like this. The crux of this game was the play grid. It was a hunk of plastic that took 4 AA batteries. So each card had a barcode on it, and then you'd scan the offensive play and the defensive play to see how things went down. This is something I could very much see if this was done today, it would just be a phone app. Or if they really wanted to do something like this, it would just be a phone game entirely. Apparently the play grid was awful. It would constantly have hard times actually reading the cards. It got better as the series went along, but it was a little too late. Something I found really funny was this ad for NFL Showdown 2002, which looks like it was in some magazine. Sports Illustrated for kids, I'd imagine. It tells you to hit the field. This scanner calculates all the game stats so you don't miss any of the fast-paced NFL action. As if those stats weren't the actual fun part of the game. It'd be like if you played a game of Magic and you just like snapped a picture of the board state with your phone when you went to combat, and then the phone app says, oh yeah, your opponent takes 3 damage. Except the play grid didn't look like a phone, it looked like a Happy Meal toy. I also found it really funny because at the bottom of this ad, it's telling you to like play the other games, but at this point there was only NFL and MLB Showdown, since NBA Showdown didn't exist. NFL Showdown only lasted from 2001 to 2003, but that's still 3 times as long as NBA Showdown. NBA Showdown returned to the D20 style of play. They had a cult following to it, but a cult following was not enough to keep it afloat, so it only lasted the 2002 season. Looking at these as a whole, it was clear they're trying to go for this connected brand here with the Showdown name. That name is so uninspired and like unoriginal. So much so that MLB Showdown is the only one that works with search engine optimization in the year 2024. NFL Showdown has to fight with a board game that came out in 2018, and there's a video game for the Super Nintendo from 1993 called NBA Showdown. Since then, there's been several other attempts at physical card games that are based off of sports, but it's all over the place. Looking at it today, I honestly think there's no way it could work now. Not only do I think the market isn't necessarily there, but I think there are better alternatives. For each sport that EA Sports puts out a game for, they offer a game mode called Ultimate Team. It allows people to spend currency they earned in-game or real-life money to buy game pieces. It visually uses a lot of card game motifs, but when it comes down to it, it's just a normal, you're playing as your sports team. You just happen to have spent $50 real on a Patrick Mahomes card. The only major sports that EA doesn't do this for is basketball and baseball, but I assure you 2K with basketball and MLB The Show with baseball, they both have very similar systems. It can often be really addicting, but you're often just playing the core game with your own fancy team. This business model is super toxic and parasitic, especially when you consider what would be called rotation in other games. Magic players like to scoff at standard for rotation. A large selection of the card pool every year is not playable anymore. Ultimate Team is directly tied to the game that it's on, and since they release a new Madden, NHL, FIFA, and MLB game every year, you aren't losing half of the entire pool, you're losing the entire pool. Not to mention games like this have a weird relationship with power creep. Any game that lasts long enough has to worry about power creep. Magic might put a card in the new set that is super strong and does something better than it's ever been done before, but if they keep doing that over and over again, enough people are going to catch on and they'll just stop buying the next set because they know the set immediately after is going to have something more exciting. Ultimate Team does not need to worry about this. People know that this game only has a shelf life of 12 months at most, so cards are going to start out weak, but 7 months later, you're going to have a god team. This might be a weird tangent, but I actually started making this channel or taking it seriously around the year 2020. Before that, I used to be really into Madden Ultimate Team. I would play hardcore from like August to August. I never spent too much money on it. Like even during that time, I'd spend more money on Magic than I would on Ultimate Team. But yeah, really toxic. I'm really glad I made my way out of there. Let's look at another wacky TCG. How about the Beyblades TCG? That felt weird even to say. What is this thing? This game is literally made to simulate playing with Beyblades. Cards have a spin strength. Just play the actual Beyblades game. I beg of you. That's a quick one. Let's jump to another one. How about Fight Club? Yeah, you heard that right. Fight Club. Well, this has nothing to do with the book or the movie. How dense do you have to be to accidentally name your product that is a definite cash grab after a critique of consumerism? And you know what makes matters worse? It's a hub game. I came up with the term hub game in our last video, but essentially there are a lot of card games that exist out there that it's its own system, it's made by a certain company, and then they just get a bunch of IPs that throw their design at them. Hey, I own whatever this thing is, I want you to put it into a card game. It was a game made by Decipher Inc. that a bunch of companies just threw a bunch of money at, just so their IP could be thrown into the mix. Have you ever wanted Jason Voorhees, Hannibal Lecter, Rambo, Ash from the Evil Dead series, Jigsaw, Chuck Norris, Mr. Blonde from Reservoir Dogs, RoboCop, Terminator, and Willem Dafoe's character from Platoon to all fight? Because boy do I have the card game for you. It's called Magic the Gathering's New Secret Fight Club. Next card game. My main focus of this video is to demonstrate how the early 2000s was a overly commercialized hellscape, and I wanted to do this through the lens of trading card games. If a company owned a property, they'd try their hardest to make just a massive profit off of it without trying. I honestly don't think there's a better example of a company beating a dead horse just because it keeps coughing up toonies than Disney with Nightmare Before Christmas. The Nightmare Before Christmas movie is a well-known stop-motion film directed by Henry Selick. That's right, people keep saying it's directed by Tim Burton, but it wasn't. Produced and story by Timmy Boy, but not directed. I don't blame anyone for making that mistake. It's honestly so Tim Burton coded. This is literally just one movie that was made like 30 years ago. Disney has plastered this IP onto, frankly, everything. This game, which came out in 2005, has the players managing their own versions of Halloween Town. The game lasts 12 rounds, one for each day of Christmas. Then everyone reveals their Halloween Town, and the scariest one wins. It's kind of admirable that they made a game that doesn't involve the 1v1 combat route. The game had 2 expansions and a third one that was planned but never released. But the crazy part to me is that there were more sets for this game than there were movies. They made one Nightmare Before Christmas movie, but holy crap, Disney won't stop trying to milk it for money. This card game came out 12 years after the movie. That gap in years would be the equivalent of them trying to make a video game based off of the Harry Potter series. Oh wait, they did that. And then people got upset because it didn't get nominated for Game of the Year. Oh no. Speaking of Harry Potter, you bet your ass salt formation that they made a Harry Potter TCG. It was made by WotC, of course. The first set came out with the first movie, and then there are 3 sets that built up the wizarding world, and then the 5th and final set came out when the second movie came out. Now I'm going to describe gameplay, and stop me if you've heard this before. 2 players both start with 60 card decks. When someone takes damage, they mill that many cards. I'm borrowing terms from Magic the Gathering. It makes it easy for me, it makes it easy for you. Capiche? Capiche. You're trying to get your opponent to 0 cards in their library. So it's milling damage all in one. Each player starts with 7 cards and draws each turn. Some things line up with Magic, some things don't. There's only so many ways you could make a card game, so I'll let it pass. There are 8 different types of cards. We probably don't need to go over all 8. Let's start with lessons. Lessons are described as the basic units in the game. Each lesson provides a single power, which can be then spent to play other cards. You might be making connections already. I'm letting it be, I'm gonna read this next line verbatim from the Wikipedia page on this game. There are 5 different lesson cards, each of which has a different symbol and color that is used to identify it on other cards. Oh, I did a little bit of some deeper diving, and you only need 1 land or 1 lesson to match the color of the card. So if you have a 4-drop and it's blue, you only need 1 island or whatever the lesson is that is watery. It gets worse. There is no limit on the lesson cards in a player's deck. A player may have as many different lesson types as they prefer. So let's reiterate. There are 5 lesson types that each have a color and a symbol attributed to them. You need to have enough of these to play cards. You can have as many as you want in the deck. Each one has a color and has some deeper philosophy attached to it. I could see someone arguing, well, resource management is something that's present in pretty much any card game like this. But this game was A, made by Wizards of the Coast. You know, the guys behind Magic the Gathering. And B, each color has its own identity. Let's quickly run through Harry Potter the Gathering. Brown is care of magical creatures. It focuses primarily on creatures and dealing damage, so it's green. Blue is charms. It is known for small but flexible bits of damage. It also has some exclusive effects like being able to tutor up cards. Starting to see black in there with a mix of maybe a little other stuff like white. Green is potions. They're more expensive cards that might require you to sacrifice your lands, but you'd be rewarded because these spells are stronger. This feels like green with a tinge of black. Yellow is Quidditch. This was actually introduced partway through the game being out. This game at least had the gall to add another color. It specializes in cards with more than one effect, so effectively this is the color of power creep. So green again. The final color is red for transfiguration, and it was made to interact with your opponent's cards rather than actually doing anything. So blue and black. This game also has the card types spells, items, and locations. Spells are essentially instants and sorceries in Magic, items are artifacts, enchantments, and locations are world enchantments. It's a card type you don't see too often today, but you definitely would have back then. There are some definite differences between games, but holy crap. I can't tell if I should call this Harry Potter the Gathering or Harry Potter and the self-plagiarization. This video is already going to be like the longest video I've ever made. I'm looking at the recording and I'm almost at 50 minutes. It's the longest thing I've written besides my ever-growing everything you need to know about dragons video that I hope to release sometime in my life. I'll leave you off with one last TCG. One of the craziest ones I covered in my last video was American Idol. I just thought it was so wacky that you could make a game based off of a reality television show and have like real people on the cards. I was not ready to learn that there was a game based off of Survivor. You quite literally play the game Survivor in card game form. You pick a former contestant, you play through mini games, hoping to vote off your opponent's characters. Now looking at the cards without actually knowing the game, it reads like a weird tabletop role-playing game. Oh, Sue has 7 accuracy and 8 politics, but only 4 wits. I have been talking a lot about how this era of card game was so ripe and full of cash grabs, but nothing quite feels as devoid from reality as a game based off of a reality television show. Thank you for joining me on this wild and bizarre adventure. We saw a lot of collectible and trading card games that died and should frankly stay dead. I've been Harrison, thanks for watching. Don't forget to bolt your birds. I'm gonna try to I got a fancy new camera, I'm gonna try to make it focus on my finger so I'm pointing at you. It ain't working.